I was always interested, having come to Knoxville, Tennessee. It's in East Tennessee, 35 miles from the Smoky Mountains, so from the big, great national park. And it's about 120 miles from Nashville. I came from Kansas City, Missouri. I may have been staying in Chicago with my grandmother that summer before I moved. I was going on 8.5. I'd had rheumatic fever, recovered, lived at my uncle's summer house, which was outside of, forget the suburb, sort of hilly country, west of Chicago. And I had been very ill with recovering from rheumatic fever. Had missed a year of school, first grade, after coming back from Santiago de Chile, where I'd been there for 6 months with my parents and sister. I was born in Chicago. My uncle had a summer house about 45 minutes from Evanston, where my grandmother lived and where I had lived with my parents after I came home from the hospital on Hinman Avenue, 1019 Hinman, right near the lake. Used to go to the lake all the time as a little baby boy with a little hat on to keep from getting sunburned. My grandmother had a magnificent house a half block from Lake Michigan, the beach where I used to walk down. I was free to go when I pleased out there, and sometimes I waded into the water. It was on her house was on the corner of Ingleside and Sheridan Road, and up the hill was, from her house around the corner, was the Baja Temple, and then there was Ridge Avenue. It was a kind of ridge running across that went down from coming sort of northwest and went over to Willamette, where there was a harbor and people kept their sailboats. There was a little marina there. I could actually get up there, walking up Michigan, Lake Michigan, along the beach with my friend Shirley, whose family were the servants of the Appleton family, their big mansion on Lake Michigan, up the street, up Sheridan Road, about a block and a half from us, and was her mother was the cook for the Appleton family. They Arthur Appleton, or Art Appleton, was my Uncle Jack's best friend during his boyhood, growing up in Evanston, in this big house, 2703 Sheridan Road. It was a yellow brick house with a lot of bedrooms and a big, beautiful attic and a kind of playroom up there, where my mother and my uncle and my father used to have dance parties. They had a wonderful collection of records of people like Big Spiderbeck and other 20s jazz, dance, swing people. I used to play those records myself, and Appletons were very rich. Another rich friends of my grandparents were the Eustaces. And the Eustace, Mr. Eustace, the daughter was my mother's best friend. Um, Forget her first name. Um, Mr. Eustace had invented the fuse, made a huge amount of money in that. They had a great summer place on Lake Michigan, up the lake about 80 miles on Lake Michigan, on the edge of the lake. And I think some children had died in a freak accident. They'd gone out, just gone out in a boat, 2 kids, and unaccompanied by parents, unfortunately, and they never came back. It was a great tragedy. It was Ibby Eustace. I forget her parents' name. I remember there was an English couple, rather elegant, Monty or something, and my grandfather, John Presley Landers, who was in the railway supply business and had started Spring Packing Corporation, and bought a patent from a man, which was a very simple patent of cotton waste threads with little copper springs kind of tumbled into them that gave the cotton waste resiliency. It was used to prevent hot boxes and put in journal boxes outside of the spinning, rotating journal on which the bearing, which is a kind of a polished steel, maybe about as big as your hand or your foot. The whole extension of the wheel of the train, rotating wheel, which was called the journal, rested on this bearing. And that bearing, if it were not lubricated, could get cherry red and actually just melt from friction and break off and cause a huge wreck. Sometimes trains were stopped because of a hot box. And that's what Spring Packing Company, my grandfather's product, Spring Packing, with these little copper springs tumbled into the cotton waste threads, which you could buy for fractionally nothing. He made about $35,000 a year after the depression on that. And in fact, he'd borrowed he lost $1.5 million in the stock market when it crashed. And he went down to the Great Northern Bank and asked to borrow $450,000, and they gave it to him. And he used that to buy back into the market when stocks were about $4 or $5 or $2 to $6, and it started going back up. Then he actually recouped all that he lost, $1.5 million, and paid back the $450,000 to Great Northern Bank by the time he died. And so my grandmother, Mabel Virginia Redmond Landers, inherited a nice legacy from her husband and a lot of stocks. And I think also his oil lease interests, which were beginning to generate some revenues. This was in 1953 or 52 when my grandfather died. And then she died about a year and a half later. And there were trusts set up for the grandchildren. And she was actually making about oil revenues, royalties of about $70,000 a year, including the stocks and bonds that my grandfather had bought, had chosen and put together in a portfolio, uh, and paid off all these debts. I mean, from the crash, and from also paid off the loan, the $450,000 loan, and the man who was the loan officer at Great Northern was named Dave Sweet, and when somebody asked him, well, this was not a collateralized loan. How was it that the bank would be willing to loan almost $500,000 without a collateral? Well, he said, I just believed in Mr. Landers. I looked at his books, his business. He's making $35,000 a year from these spring packing sales to all the major railroads, the Burlington, Great Northern, Santa Fe, and he'd also selling to West Coast, the Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, and I believed in him. So we made that loan, and he paid all of it, every penny of it back, and bought in wisely when the market was the lowest and starting to go up again, getting stocks that would go up to maybe $50 a share for as much as $2, $3, $4, $5 a piece. And I made a good judgment, a call. And yes, I probably could have lost my job if we'd had a president who was really, of our bank, who was really shrewd and trying to protect the bank and supervising all of what we did, all of us loan officers and what we did. I might have lost my job with another manager of the bank, but I discussed it with the president of the bank, and he agreed that Mr. Landers, John P. Landers, was a good risk. That it was not, that there was no, that our funds were not in jeopardy, and we just went with it. That's what he told my uncle Jack when Jack asked him about that transaction, the loan that was granted to my grandfather, and which he so wisely paid off and used to invest, to buy back into the market. And also, he'd always go out every year to Los Angeles, to Pasadena, stay in the Maryland Hotel, and with all the family, stay out there the children would be out of school for a month and a half, and they would take, books that keep up with all their grade school courses, reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, and whatever else they would study. And they would, I don't even think they had a tutor in Pasadena, but it was wonderful for my mother. She absolutely loved Los Angeles. She'd go into Hollywood with Ibby Eustace. They dressed up, and they were trying to be noticed, to some producer decide they were going to cast them in something, and they go out to Santa Monica to the wonderful. That was the pier, which was which had all sorts of amusements, games you could play. Um, this game was a sliding little, sort of like shuffleboard, except you did it just with your hand. On sawdust on a hard surface, a metal surface, and you slide this, against and um, try to knock over pins and stuff like that. I took my mother back to the uh, the pier, the Santa Monica pier, uh, uh, one of her last years before she died after my father had passed away, and she was so excited about that. There was also a beautiful rose garden planted high above Pacific Coast Highway, which was down the hill, sort of like a cliff, a little bit scary, but a beautiful view of the Pacific Ocean and the beaches, all the way down toward, going way down toward, um, down the Santa Monica Bay toward, in the direction of Malibu. And there was a beautiful rose garden. I took her in a wheelchair, which I had in the back of her Fifth Avenue, a big car that my friend Lothar helped her buy from a dealer, a used car dealer, and I put her a little wheelchair that I could fold up, and it was pretty light. Put it in the trunk, and I'd just push her wheelchair down the nice paths along Santa Monica Boulevard, and through the Rose Garden. She loved that. It was one of our nicest times. We had many nice times. I mean, I take her to Century City to the movies. I actually took her to see Little Women, the Louisa May Alcott book, and that was made into a movie, and it was so moving. I mean, to all these scenes of Massachusetts and Concord, Massachusetts, which I was away from for several months at that time, and she loved it. She and I loved that movie. And it was a lovely evening we had after going to dinner at this little Italian restaurant near Century City. And we just pushed her right over. And there was a mall near one of the grocery stores. I think it was Jelson's. And a whole complex of movie theaters. And she'd sit in the back end where the handicapped people would sit in a wheelchair or in a nice seat there. And we had a wonderful evening seeing Little Women. I forget who was in there or who directed it, but it was a terrific adaptation of that Louisa May Alcott novel, which was sort of written for young adults. And it was a wonderful evening. And I mean, she was getting quite ill. She had a lot of arthritis, terrible arthritis, and she was soon to have kidney failure and need dialysis treatments every 3 days. And this is before I brought her back to Boston, so she could be near me and my family. Pat, my wife, and Nicholas was going to school nearby at Brooks School, and Davy was, at that point, he was doing his postdoctorate at Berkeley, up in Berkeley, California. He had not gotten his appointment to Harvard yet as assistant professor. So he was up at Berkeley, and would come down for weekends to help me with my sister, who was dying of pancreatic cancer at that point. After Raven died on November 24th, I took my mother back to Boston. I think it was maybe mid-January. We flew first class back to Boston, and a very pleasant trip, no hitches. And then she stayed in our house in 24 Lee Street in Cambridge for about 3 weeks before we were able to move her into a really nice apartment in the Prudential Center, where there was high-rise apartments right near a big mall, which she loved to go to. She'd have her hair done at Elizabeth Arden's. Somebody would wheel her over, one of the Irish women who was taking care of her. And then she goes, be wheeled through the mall, buy whatever she needed for herself, clothes or get something to eat. Also, there was an Armani's Italian restaurant on Newbury Street. I often took her to other restaurants. And I mean, some nice places to amuse her with, and some art galleries. And then occasionally I would take her to the Museum of Fine Arts, which she absolutely loved. I'd taken her to a wonderful show of Impressionists that was at the Los Angeles County Museum, which is on Wilshire Boulevard. And I remember a beautiful painting of it was of Luxembourg Gardens done by one of the Impressionists. Maybe it was Vuillard, Manet, perhaps. I'm not exactly sure who. It was an absolutely gorgeous picture. And I'd just recently been to France and was soon, after my mother died, to go back to Paris. I'd been there in '84 with all my family, taken them from Newton. We'd all been over there for a year. And Eric was doing his year abroad. He was at the University of Chicago. Jessica was at Concord Academy, and she did about 5 months at the École Bilingue, and then wanted to come back to graduate from Concord. It was a great year we had in 1984. We were living in the 4th arrondissement on Rue de Mézières near the Place Saint-Sulpice, the beautiful church there, where Messiaen used to play the organ, and another great composer lived there, Vidor, I think it was. He used to play the organ there. And I remember my father and Domingo Santa Cruz went to hear Messiaen playing once. They had a huge organ. I mean, it's just one of those magnificent, not a Baroque organ, but a kind of romantic, a 19th century organ that was, I mean, had a volume that was just makes the stones of the church of Saint-Sulpice shake. Wonderful, wonderful experience. And since we lived near Luxembourg Garden, I was there with Nicholas, who was going to the Cour des Irs right across from catty corner from the Abbaye Saint-Germain on Boulevard Saint-Germain, right across from the Dumas Grove. I'd take him to school in the morning, and then after school we'd go to the Luxembourg Gardens almost every day, where I'd draw 2 drawings of the trees there and the wonderful scenes, compositions. And I actually later did use those drawings to do some oil paintings. And all the oil paintings of the trees, they all were down. They were all had been blown down or in the great raging storm of 1999, the end of the 20th century. Before there was a huge storm. I think 35,000 trees were blown down in the raging winds, and our marvelous property that we sold for almost $1.5 million when it was changed into dollars. We had a big poplar blown down in that storm. The owners of the property near Cambramere, which was actually called Le Frenet on Rue d'Arc-d'Escoville, said that the house didn't even shake. The house was so solid with those exposed timbers, Tudor style. It did blow down one poplar, and we have beautiful trees on that property. It was bought by a man who was born in Sicily, in Palermo, named Matteo Fabra, and he's now done a lot of renovation and running it as a bed and breakfast, making quite a lot of money out of it. I mean, he's paying for a lot of the tremendous expenses in renovating our marvelous house, which was built in 1542. But I want to talk about Knoxville. I came to Knoxville when I was almost 9 from Missouri. I think I'd been at my grandmother's when I was healing up from rheumatic fever, which I got as soon as I came back right after Christmas. I was 7 years old, and I had to go to bed for 3 months and missed the first grade. The next year, after I recovered, I went to live at my uncle's with a nurse named Mrs. Baumann, a German lady who was a nurse, and had been hired to look after me. Always stayed at my uncle's, and it was very difficult for me because she wouldn't let me get up until 7:30 in the morning. Of course, in the summer I was up at 7, at least, or earlier. And I had a little stack of comic books that I would just look at, you know, flip the pages through, just following the stories from the pictures, and was not allowed to get up or come down. I'd have to wait an hour and a half before I could have breakfast and get dressed and come down. And the doctor said I was not allowed to run or jump. That I'd had a heart murmur, and I had to be very careful about straining my heart. So no running or jumping. And the neighbor boy I found as a playmate, I couldn't do a lot of things he might have wanted to do, but we did a lot of roaming around the terrain near my uncle's country house. And then I got into some trouble with throwing rocks at cars. And went to my grandmother's in Evanston, which was always a dream come true for me. She was so loving and had wonderful things to eat. And I could go to the lake by myself. And if it were hot, I'd wade in and sometimes be taken swimming. And absolutely loved her houses, full of beautiful antiques and beautiful oriental rugs. And always my grandmother, who had been quite ill with kidney trouble and heart trouble and diabetes, had women taking care of her. A Italian woman named Mrs. Caruso, I think, and who lived in. I'm just thinking, she lived outside of Evanston, to the west of Evanston. At any rate, when we got to Knoxville, our house, my parents bought a house for $44,000 from a Dr. Zemp, whose daughter Russell Zemp they got to know as a friend. Dr. Zemp was an interesting man who people used to say that after his wife died, he could walk behind him. He was always whistling Merry Widow Waltz. And he had this wonderful house overlooking the Tennessee River. Really beautiful house. And Mrs. Zemp, who had died, he was a widower, had planted the most extraordinarily beautiful bushes and plantings. I mean, we had cherry trees, we had a crepe myrtle tree, we had mimosa trees, we had magnolia trees, which would have these huge blossoms, like bigger than your hand, you know, and with this very pungent, wonderful odor of perfume when they were blooming. I mean, we cut those blossoms, my mother would cut the blossoms off and just lay those blooms in a bowl, a circular bowl. I remember it was a kind of a pale light green bowl. Just lay the bloom in the middle of the bowl of water, and it was so fragrant, it would perfume the whole downstairs. You know, when it was blooming in August, these magnolia trees that were down below the house on this rock garden, which had these rock paths that would zigzag back and forth from the level that our house was built on, back and forth down to the lower garden. And then there were two huge pecan trees making a kind of V, and then two cherry trees making a V, which we always thought of as our initials were Van Vactor. My mother's linens were embroidered with VVV because she was Virginia Van Vactor, triple V. And anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about the social history of Knoxville, Tennessee. This is 1947 when we arrived. My father had been given the job of starting a fine arts department at the University of Tennessee, and he had to hire musicians and artists. And he was also given the job of conductor of the Knoxville Symphony, which was founded by the lady Bertha Walburn Clark, who had founded she played the violin and the second violins in his orchestra, and she was also my violin teacher for about a year. And it was an amateur orchestra, but by the time he got through it, it became a competent orchestra, and many of the first stand players, like the second violin, or the concertmaster William Starr, was a very fine violinist who had gone to Japan to work with Suzuki, and really got Suzuki violin established with his wife Connie, who was a violist and also an excellent pianist, and often would perform as soloists for the Knoxville Symphony piano concertos. They wrote a lot about Suzuki sight singing for piano and Suzuki violin, having spent a year in Japan with the master himself. And both of them really together as a team got Suzuki violin started and established for a long term in America. I mean, it's an amazing technique. Children start fairly young, at the age of 6, 7, and I mean, in a year and a half, they can actually place a Vivaldi violin concerto. I mean, it's just an amazing learning technique the Japanese really genius named Suzuki started and perfected, and Bill and Connie really perfected it and got it started in America, so it, and it stuck. It really works. And my granddaughter Amanda is now using some of that to learn violin, and I hope she sticks with it. She should. She's doing piano too. Um, what I want to say about Knoxville is that Knoxville was a little bit alienating after Kansas City, Missouri. We were on my grandmother's farm during the war near Marshall, Missouri, in Saline County. Our farm was 10 miles from town, which was the county seat of Saline County, and not far from Sedalia, where actually we had some relatives, the Thompsons. That's the same family as Virgil Thompson. And my grandmother knew all the people in the whole, all around the farm that she inherited from her father, James Thompson Redmond, one of the first families of St. Louis, not the founding family, which was actually a French family named Chuteau. And but the Redmonds were one of the leading families who lived on Washington Avenue. That's where they got Washington University from, I think. WashU, they call it now. A beautiful, brilliant literary scholar with whom I dated when I was getting my master's degree at University of Connecticut. Mary Lynn Breaux later became a professor at Grinnell University in Iowa, Grinnell, Iowa. Published a book on Sylvia Plath, brilliant book. University of Missouri Press did it, came out with it. She was president of her senior class in college at where she went to get her PhD at University of Connecticut, at Washington University. She was president of the senior class. She was almost 6 feet tall, absolutely beautiful young woman, and brilliant. And she later went to Notre Dame, and where she finished her PhD and wrote her book on Sylvia Plath, her dissertation. And this is before they did a 5-year search or something, and before they hired her at Grinnell as a full professor. And I think she ended up living in Ithaca, New York, with many friends at Cornell. And I won't talk more about her, but I just want to talk about Knoxville, Tennessee, because it's a very interesting society when we moved there. There were mill owners, families. There was the family who owned the company that milled wheat and made flour. It was called White Lily Flour. The White family was the most prominent family. And there was a mill owner's family, the Atkins, and another mill owner's family called the Ashes. One of my best friends was Lawrence Ashe, his brother Victor, named after his grandfather, J. Victor Henderson, who was a doctor and had a private hospital. Victor Ashe Lawrence's younger brother became mayor of Knoxville and had actually been a state senator and in the state in the state house, Tennessee State House, very much following his mother's direction to pursue that career. And Howard Baker was the senator, Republican senator from Tennessee, and a really great man, a friend of our family's. And when Howard Baker retired from his Senate seat, Victor Ashe ran against Al Gore and lost. Al Gore got Baker's Senate seat. And of course, he should have, I think, been president of the United States. We'd have been in a much better place than George Bush getting it. In fact, Gore really won the popular vote. But the Bush family friend, James Baker, turned it over to the Supreme Court, I think, who just railroaded Bush into office, very much at the detriment of the whole country. I think Gore would have been a much better president. We'd never gotten into the Iraq War and done a lot more for the environment. I mean, Gore's a great contribution for which he won a Nobel Peace Prize. The documentary he made called An Inconvenient Truth about global warming. Finally, people are beginning to admit that it is a fact and not just some fiction made up by a bunch of scientists. Anyway, no more on that subject. The other marvelous family that we were very close to, by the name of Lutz. Edith Lutz was the biggest donor to the Knoxville Symphony and a very close friend, a family friend. I was a good friend of hers as a child, and she was a very good friend of both my mother and father. She was very, very supportive of my father and gave more money than anybody else in the whole town to the symphony. It was very hard to get anybody to give money. They were very tight-fisted in East Tennessee, very frugal. They don't give money easily. Now some corporations, some businesses in Knoxville are giving. The Knoxville Symphony goes on. My father conducted it for 25 years, almost 28 years, going on 28 years. And it's still going on. And he built it into a really pretty good orchestra. I mean, a lot of the best people in the orchestra, like Bill Starr and some of the trumpet player, Joe Gebrecht, and we had a very good oboist, Tom Wheeler, who was a professor of English, got his PhD at North Carolina. But the society, there was most of the people in Knoxville, most of the wealthy people, families, children did not go north to school like I did. By going to Lawrenceville School, I was able to get into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. They went to the University of Tennessee. They didn't have the education I had by any means. I think it was John Carter who had gone to Lawrenceville, and because Hal Mebane went there. And I'd gone on a big fishing trip to Canada with him and my father when I was about 13, right before I went to Lawrenceville. And Mebane could have gone to Princeton. Usually Lawrenceville students went to Princeton, but Princeton wanted me to play football, and I really had enough of football. And it's good I didn't play because I'd probably gotten my brains battered and have dementia by now. But these wealthy families in Knoxville, the Lutzes lived in a grand house with a serpentine brick wall in front of it, and they built a second house behind it, um, and next to Edith Lutz's mother, Mrs. Holloway, and her daughter, Cecil, had been married to a man named Matheny who died. She was a widow, very beautiful woman. And Mrs. Holloway had a grand house before, and her son had been wounded in the Second World War. And actually, they'd had British children who had come over to seek refuge from the bombings and lived with the Holloways. And they were very close to some British families because of that. And there was a family named Hearst who had an art, a painting, framing business, and the son of the Hearst, one son was Eddie Hearst, who was a very good painter and lived in London. And when my father conducted the London Philharmonia, Eddie Hearst was living there, and I remember going the summer before that. I didn't attend that concert in 1953 because I was in school, and so I couldn't go to London to hear my father conduct this romantic program with the London Philharmonia, which I deeply regret. And as I made a point earlier, in the, I believe it was in the park called High Hurdler, before the Lake Fontana section, I said that my father should have done, instead of Tchaikovsky symphonies and Chausson symphonies and the list of piano concertos, he should have done his own Symphony in D, which won the New York Philharmonic Prize. But he had premiered, conducted in New York, with good criticism. I mean, he had a 5-page spread in Time magazine at that time. Was actually the most played composer in the United States. My point was that instead of playing these other works of other well-known European composers, he should have played his own music. He probably would have become much more famous having a great symphony orchestra like the Philharmonia do it. He would have had a career in Europe after that if he'd made that choice. But sometimes people just don't make a choice in their own interest. They're trying to do something the safe way, and he did a great concert, got some very good critiques, but didn't really do his career that much good. And it was actually his engagements and his with the Frankfurt Radio Orchestra that allowed him to record his own music and a lot of other American composers. And but going back to the sort of first families of Knoxville in the time from 1947 when I was 9, almost 9, until I went away at 13 in 1953 to Lawrenceville School near Princeton, New Jersey, and just about an hour from New York on the train. Getting it from Princeton Junction or Trenton, and so I was in there every weekend. My sister had been going to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and so I would stay with her on 76th Street in her apartment filled with my grandmother's furniture, which she got after my grandmother was deceased. And she was a block from Central Park West, beautiful location, wonderful street, right near 72nd Street, and wonderful Cuban restaurants and all sorts of terrific places. I mean, 84th Street became developed in one of the best areas in the city after that. Anyway, so back to Knoxville families. So some of the people had one of the richest man in Knoxville was Hugh Sanford, who had gone to Harvard and had a place on Nantucket where he summered with his family. He had gone to Harvard, and I think I was the only person among my friends who come up to going to Sequoia Elementary School in Sequoia Hills, about 20 minutes from my house on Kingston Pike, above the Tennessee River. I was the only person who went to a school like Harvard or Princeton. My girlfriend's brother went to Hotchkiss, and Lawrence Ash went to Hotchkiss and Princeton, but I was the only one in my time, except my doctor's son, Russell Chesney, went to Harvard, and then another friend of mine who had gone to Lawrenceville, ended up at Harvard. Mike Adams, his father was a doctor in Kingsport, Tennessee, where the Kingsport Press was. He went to camp with me, Sequoia Camp near Weaverville, outside of Weaverville, North Carolina, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. And then he went to Harvard, went to Lawrenceville and Harvard, and played quarterback for Harvard. I didn't play at Harvard. Thank goodness for the state of my brain, because tackling people head on, going full speed, even with those Riddell helmets, was really not sufficient protection to keep from getting concussions. And a lot of these football players now are having dementia. Thank God I still can remember and don't have Alzheimer's or things I've seen others die of. I'm sorry, I'm rattling on. It's I've got the sociology of Knoxville. I mean, they're the most illustrious family, and they're one of the richest were the whites. One of the Lindsays, Powell Lindsay. Powell was another family name. Lily Powell Lindsay, and Powell Lindsay had gone to Lawrenceville actually, and I don't know where he went to college. Came back to Knoxville after Lawrenceville, and he actually was a writer at Lawrenceville, and he published in the little magazine that my friend Robert Victor edited. He later edited the Harvard Advocate. Was president of the Harvard Advocate, and then Powell Lindsay wrote a lot of stories that Richard Fadum, who edited the Lit, where I published stories, a novella, one novella and one short story prize from in my senior year. We used to go through the boxes of the papers of the Lit, some of the, sort of like an archive, and read Powell Lindsay's stories. I mean, he's a good writer and very talented. His family was very interesting. It's related to the Whites, and that's where you get Lily Powell, White Lily Powell, and his sisters were beautiful. The Lindsay sisters were the beautiful, some of the prettiest girls in town. And they, the whole social life went around whether you, in what country club you were admitted to and or chosen to join. The first country club we belonged to was Dean Hill, and the Deans were had a beautiful big sort of plantation house off of the road that went to Nashville, the extension of Kingston Pike, out towards Kingston, in the direction that was the road you drove out all the way out to Nashville, and it was the Dean Hill Country Club was off the Pike, which is a big highway, going down past a plantation house owned by the Paces. The daughter was a friend of my sister. Tom Pace was a very handsome man, and they lived in a beautiful plantation house. But the Dean Hill Country Club was in a big house up the hill, going over toward, it goes over toward what is now West Knoxville, and a lot of housing, and eventually gets to the Tennessee River. Where my father and I used to go fishing down from a road that went outside of Knoxville, west. We go out to drive out that road, country road, out to Admiral Farragut's birthplace on the river, where now our friend Lee Duran lives, and George and June Devine had lived, my father's copyist, and he'd been a professor of musicology with just a high school education at UT. My father brought him down there as his copyist from Chicago, and George and June lived in this house that had been Admiral Farragut's birthplace house, a beautiful setting right on the river. And June did a lot of fishing. There was a little cove, put in a boat. There was a boat landing right there, and not far down was another boat landing, Chodo Dock, where my father put our canoe in on from its trailer, and we could also rent boats at Chodo Dock. We didn't need to take our own boat, and go downriver into these beautiful coves and go bass fishing. Spent a lot of time out there on the river. It was called Lenore Lake. There was a Lenore Dam down near there, was where my friend Richard Marius, who was really one of the greatest writers from East Tennessee, always felt, he said, I mentioned my friend David Madden. He said, oh, he's my worst nightmare. I mean, he had written published a book that went into paperback called Bound for Glory that actually my mother liked quite a bit. And then his big novel after the war was about his father, who was from Greece and had been in the Second World War and come back. And Richard had grown up on the farm down from Lenore, Tennessee, and that's how you get Lake Lenore. I mean, we've got a Lenore right near here in Normandy. It's Lenoir. It means really the black. There's a town not far from here called Lenoir, and or Loudon, and it was called Loudon here. It was called Lake Loudon, actually, the Tennessee, where because it was dammed up further down, became very wide, really a lake called Lake Loudon, and Maris's family had a big farm, and he did a lot of farming as a youngster, helping his father. I think he was a captain of the wrestling team at the University of Tennessee, and then after graduating, he went to Yale and got his PhD in church history. I think he was actually an ordained minister, and he ended up. I had taught after getting my MA at University of Connecticut. I taught expository writing at Harvard College for about 7 years, and then right at the end of my that period of time phase of teaching expository and then creative writing at Harvard to Harvard College freshmen, and then some very interesting students later, who shows up as head of expository writing, Richard Marius. And then I got a job teaching at Milton Academy, and he actually joined my club, which was called the Signet Society, which he really loved. And he published his big novel with Alfred Knopf and Company in New York, and called After the War. I remember seeing him at the Harvard Faculty Club one day, and he came in and he was walking from the far room into the larger room where I was sitting at lunch, probably after having taught class in the morning. I would eat lunch at the faculty club. And he had a big smile on his face, as if he were waiting people to compliment him because he'd gotten such good reviews for his novel in the New York Times. But anyway, we had some nice talks. He and I had been in a anti-Vietnam War chapter of an organization called Vietnam Now, and we actually I wrote a protest essay which he actually proofread and made some corrections on, which he read it out at the rally that we had. We had an black Episcopal minister whose name was Jones, Reverend Jones, and we also had some other people who were activists in towns, Ruby Bishop and her husband, who committed suicide later. And then there was another couple who had been in the Southern labor movement. It was quite interesting. These politically active people in this East Tennessee small town, university town, where the University of Tennessee was. And the elite of the town was really, there was a street, 17th Street, where our friends, the Durands, Lowell Durand was a professor at the University of Geography, and we had a very good law school, to which some of my friends got their law degree. I think Lawrence Ash got his law degree there, and Philip Durand, the Durands, not their oldest, Randy was the oldest Durand son. He'd gone to Yale, and he was a professor of physics later, a brilliant physicist after his Yale education. But Philip had gone into the Marines, and then after he got back from the Marines, and had been in Nairobi and in Africa after the Marines, I think in the Peace Corps, he came back to Knoxville, got his law degree. I remember his writing papers about Sophocles that he let Hugh Sanford read, and they were rather good. Phil was a very bright fellow who'd gone to Yale. My friend Kemper went to Yale. He rode for Yale, later became a lawyer, had married a fine girl from a good family in Memphis, and had a flourishing practice in Memphis, and died about a year ago of a heart attack. After coming in, he was just sitting down in a chair. I talked to his brother Lee about it, who's now living out at the Farragut property on the river, and had a wonderful talk with him about Kemper. And Kemper, I think, did graduate from UT Law School, which is a very fine law school. Another friend of mine, John Lockridge, went there, and I probably should have gone there myself. After my business experience in Chicago, I was back in Knoxville for about 2 years with my son Davey after his mother left us and ran off with her Shakespeare professor that she'd had at Rutgers, who was later knighted by the Queen, Frank Kermode. And I should have come back to Knoxville and gotten a law degree, because instead of just trying to be a writer and later becoming a publisher and a magazine editor, it would have been a lot more sensible to have a real profession like law. I'd probably be good at it. I think I didn't have enough confidence to try something like that and see it through. But so the elite families at that time, of course the richest man, Hugh Sanford, and his daughter Polly. Polly was married to a man, I remember his name. I think one of the Hugh Sanford's grandsons went to Lawrenceville too, and ended up in San Francisco. Very interesting. People who had a lot of money could have sent their children to any good school like Exeter, Andover, or Choate, or Taft School, and then gone on to Yale or Princeton. I had a friend here who went to Choate and Princeton, and then went on to Stanford Law School, ended up practicing international law, and then I think he got a degree at Strasbourg in international law. Boynton Rawlings, who was born in San Antonio, Texas, and went up from San Antonio to Choate. I probably played against him because we beat Choate the year I played varsity football at Lawrenceville, and he was a big fellow. He probably was playing tackle or something for Choate. The Saturday we beat Choate, and I did some of my best runs. Gained 10, 15 yards, some of my runs right straight, off tackle runs, and we're using the single wing. Everybody was using T with a quarterback in those times, but I wasn't really fast enough to play halfback, and but I made the first touchdown of the season against Trenton High School, and written up in the New York Times, and because of that, got elected to an office at Lawrenceville, upper house office. I forget what they called it. I think anyway. My football career at Lawrenceville was exciting for me, and I was also varsity wrestling. And of course, among the upper crust of Knoxville, Tennessee, finally we were accepted as a family, and my sister would get invited to things like the Rose Bowl, these debutante dances. There was one that she went to in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when she was still at the American Academy of Dramatic Art. She was a very beautiful girl at the age of 16, 17, 18, and particularly beautiful when she was 34. I mean, she became quite slim. I mean, she was something like 106 for a long time, and had a beautiful figure. But she was really beautiful when she was about 34 years old. And, but among the most prominent families in Knoxville, anybody who was a good athlete, this would give you a kind of edge and superiority, like my friend Chubb Smith, who died in a crash his plane, his flying a jet plane, and went into a thunderclap and went into a spin and ended up about 35 feet down in a field of mud in Georgia. A plunge down, the plane went into a spin and just crashed straight into the ground. He was probably instantly killed. And he had gone to McCauley Military School, and then he got a football scholarship, as did another friend, Robert Overholt, who now is an allergy specialist. And both he and his brother, Gene, her father was a doctor, and in Knoxville, and both he and Gene, I probably got their MD at Memphis. UT didn't have a medical school, or maybe its medical school was in Memphis. But both Gene and Bob were MDs, and Bob now has a show called Dr. Bob. His specialty is allergy, and he's a brilliant student, always the best student in elementary school, at Sequoia School, and later also brilliant at Tyson Junior High School. He went to high school at West High, the high school in West Knoxville, where my friend Sabre Stair went. Her brother, I think, went away to Hotchkiss, and then now he went also to UT Law School. And he has a flourishing practice. I think he even won a settlement against a company for $9 billion. That's Caesar Stair. It's very interesting what people end up doing, what kind of education they got, and if they have money behind them, and they get a good education, they got it made. It's the choice of what you do. I just wouldn't know what. I know that my neighbor, Leslie Leneve's father, who came from a good Memphis family, he got his degree was from UT Law School. He had a hard time with his practice of law. He ended up working for the University of Tennessee because he told me once, well, the big industry in Knoxville, Tennessee, is now the university, and then I remember him telling me that all his old friends that he and Francis had spent a lot of time with, they were having a wonderful time eating uptown at the S&W cafeteria. And they'd have wonderful times having dinner together. And he'd had a little problem with drinking, and Leslie doesn't drink at all. But Leslie got a PhD in chemical engineering, worked for uh, Celanese in, I think, in Summit, New Jersey. And the last thing I heard, he was still alive, but his wife Alice had died of cancer, who was a favorite friend of mine. And see, here again, their country club was not Dean Hill, it was Holston Hills. And then finally, we were invited to join Cherokee Country Club. Bob Overholt bought my parents' membership for $10,000. And it's a great golf club, wonderful golf course, where I spent a lot of time. And then, of course, after playing golf, you'd have a locker uh, uh, in the basement of the club and take a shower. And I remember after I had grown into puberty, my father told me that one of the men of the club were referring to me as a little stallion. I don't know. I don't know what that was based on, but it's because you have to, you'd have to put on your robe after your shower and be exposed to other men, with their getting dressed in front of their lockers, putting on dinner clothes for dinner upstairs. I mean, it was the most magnificent dining room with a balcony overlooking the Tennessee River and the mountains. I mean, it was a really fabulous place. And they'd have a great Sunday dinners with roast beef and anything you wanted to eat. I mean, fabulous food. A bar that my parents loved, and they loved all the Native Americans. George, who was the head waiter, and the favorite friends at the bar. And then my parents would go out there every Saturday night, and their friends, the principal, second violin, Harry Nidus, and um, Bill Tillery would sing, and there was a Jerry Collins band. They dance. My parents would go out to dance there every Saturday night, and had wonderful times. I mean, it was a terrific. I mean, that country club really made it life in Knoxville because we didn't have our own swimming pool for a long time, and in the very, very hot summers when it was 98 degrees and 100% humidity, humid and hot. I mean, you had to take a swim. Uh, we used the pool at Cherokee, and I also played tennis on the tennis courts and a lot of golf. My mother and I played a lot of golf together. My father played, but I had a terrible slice. It was not his best sport, and I should have stuck with tennis because although I was very good at golf, I got about I had about a 10 handicap. I shot an 84, 82 to 84. I was a terrific golfer. Uh, and now I have to play one-handed because of my strokes. My cardiovascular situation. I mean, I can't use my left hand. I can't make a fist with my left hand after my major stroke. And now I've had 9 and still going. I walked around this house, our manoir, across from the church, 36 times since my birthday, when I turned 76, 3 weeks ago. I try to go around about 8 or 9 times a day to keep fit, and very good for my heart, my legs, my balance, and I even walked around the house without a cane. A few days ago, came back and lost my balance, tripped on the rug, fell into the wall, got a huge bump on my forehead on the left side, and a little scab there, a little scrape. Fortunately, I did not. I could have opened up my skull, and I could have had a bad concussion. But Nicholas and Pat helped me through that. I was not injured, and still thinking straight. I hope this has been an interesting episode, and I'd like to do more with the social history of Knoxville. I'd like to talk about the Blunt family. There was the Blunt Mansion, which is one of the oldest families. It's actually mentioned quite a bit in the biography of Andrew Jackson, which I read. And I will talk more about the old families and some of the social life. I mean, there's actually a family with a Dutch name, Van Gilder. I don't know much about them. The professors' families are often, we had friends named Way. His father was a Episcopal bishop, Bill Way's father, and his wife's name was Day Way. She was a rather beautiful woman. And Bill Way was a professor of business law, really, at the University of Tennessee. He wrote a book about pricing the trucking industry, how they set the rates of interstate freight travel with tractor trailer trucks, big semis, and he knew quite a bit about the railroad industry too. We spent quite a bit of time with him over in North Carolina, listening to folk singers, and they were wonderful people. But I mean, a lot of the best families were like the Durans, were professors' families at the university, and as well as lawyers. Ray Jenkins, the great lawyer who defended the Army against McCarthy, and lived right sort of almost next door to Hugh Sanford's house, and very interesting, a very brilliant lawyer, trial lawyer, and he's the one who, I think he said, my wife is the most even-tempered woman in the world, mad all the time. But I want to also talk more about the Hearst family, and then there was a wonderful family, a man who had a decorating business. My mother was one of his best clients. I actually forget his name, but he was Coleman, Nate Coleman, and he had a wonderful wife. I mean, there were some terrific people, real characters. I mean, people with idiosyncrasies and style. The Barbara Fulton, who was later married to a man named Gentry. She was Barbara Gentry. I think her grandfather was named Fulton, who had invented the steam engine, and her husband once got in an argument with my father at uh, the country club, and people said, "Well, you better not fight with him, Dave, because he's a prize boxer." My father had never done boxing really. He'd done fencing, but he wasn't a boxer. I mean, he was stronger than hell from working on the farm and the lumber yard and all that. But you know, don't get in a fist fight with somebody unless you know who you're fighting. I think you've been what do they call it? As an amateur boxer. Uh, it was a town where people who were real characters. I mean, Nate Coleman was a big drinker and a very amusing man, and a lot of wonderful people. Another one of our great friends was named Bill Moore, and his wife Jean. She was from Canada, a redhead, and he was in the furniture business. And one of our best friends in North Carolina, and a friend of my grandfather, John Landreth, was Colonel Bill Allison. And all the family, we used to see them over in North Carolina when we go to the Mayview Manor. This is in the best view of the Blue Ridge Mountains I've ever seen. In fact, we bought some land there. This was I'm trying to think of the name of. It was not far from Boone, North Carolina. It was my memory usually serves me, but in this case, I can't recall the name of this place. I spent a lot of time in North Carolina during a certain period at used to play a lot of golf over there near Highland, North Carolina, and at, but the Allisons were in the furniture business in Statesville, North Carolina, and a lot of these people, like Bill Moore, would go to to Chicago to the big fair, it's a big furniture fair where they bring all their newest pieces. The Mart, the Furniture Mart in Chicago. It's right on the river. Huge building, right near the big Sears building. And the Furniture Mart. Now that was the big sales fair of the year. I mean, Pat and I would go to the American Booksellers Association fair. I mean, we took Mary Cardinal when we launched The Words to Say It. Before we ended up grossing $1 million on it, we took her to Dallas where they had the American Booksellers Convention and the big sales fair there, trade fair there, and I once went to a fair in Anaheim, California, and then I would go to all the New England booksellers fairs, and a lot of fun. And also in Washington D.C. we did an ABA fair, and when I took a lot of radical publications against the U.S. Intervention in Central America, in El Salvador, and had 3 different booths filled with radical anti-Reagan, anti-U.S. intervention in Central America materials. And also, we took the words to say it. I mean, because of these book fairs, salesmen would pick up, and bookstores would pick up the book, and learn about it, get free copies, reading copies, and then big distributors like Baker and Taylor or Ingram's, and of course it's Amazon. It's a totally different business now. But I've been in the railway supply business. Cousins are in the oil business in Texas. That's a whole nother story. And I'm sure the upper middle class families in Texas have their own different social life. I know my cousins do a big children's hospital event fundraiser every year, the Landers family, and Bill Landers and his wife Gail, and also I know their mother and father. He's Bill Jr. His father was Bill Landers too, W.A. Landers, and Bill's grandfather was Ed Landers, one of the great wildcatters of all time in Texas, who took my cousin George Landers out for a walk near Midland, Texas, across a ridge, and he said, "I'm gonna put a well there, right over that hill. I'll put another well, and then we'll do water drilling there, and it's the biggest oil field in Texas, the Landers Goldsmith Deep Unit. For drilling at depths of 1,400 feet, and then the water flooding, the fracking for gas, and the CO2 injection. That's called tertiary recovery. So I know something about the oil business, but I was never in their business. It's their business, my cousin's business, and my great uncle's business. Never my business. I was in the railway supply business, which during packing I took over after my uncle left the business to start Landers Industries, and of course he had the biggest account of anybody in the railway supply business, the Santa Fe Railroad, and he started making panels for refrigerated cars, and I started making fiberglass panels, gel-coated fiberglass panels for refrigerated trailer trucks, bringing fruit from California and Mexico, and then Jack. Well, that's a great story just in itself. He had hired the chief engineer's son, Tom Bickle, of the Santa Fe Railroad, and of course they were all invited. He had a stable of racehorses, and some of the people that he sold to were invited always to be in his box seats at the racetrack down on Wencia and other racetracks around Chicago. And anyway, I don't want to get into that story. I've said enough. I cannot afford to talk too long and strain the attention of my listener. I hope I haven't bored anybody today. So therefore I've I wrap this up and try to pursue it from other more historical directions, such as the Blunt family, um, who had the only uh, classic house in Knoxville. It's a kind of a tourist um, attraction and a beautiful house, the 18th century, one of the oldest houses in Knoxville. Maybe not as old as the plantation house of the Pace family, which is off the road to Nashville, the extension of the Kingston Pike. I forget it's called Route 3 West or something like that, or 25 West. Maybe that plantation house is older than Blunt Mansion, but it's an interesting name. It's also the same name as a great scholar who was actually a spy for um, 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 that was used by the Russian Anthony Blunt, who did all the collection of Queen Elizabeth, and he's a great expert on Poussin and Anthony Blunt. There's a movie about him and the Queen, and when she became aware that he was a spy, his secret life as a spy was also gay. He's also a homosexual, and there were a bunch of one of them went back to live the rest of their life after leaving the M5 service, the British intelligence service. He went back to live out his life in Moscow, and Blunt never went to prison for his espionage, but it was a kind of shameful affair when the Queen found that the man she depended on to manage her art collections was actually a spy. And these are Cambridge University graduates, and always a lot of homosexual hanky-panky, especially with John Maynard Keynes, E.M. Forster, Wittgenstein, also homosexual. Very interesting, these sidelines of rather famous and brilliant, extremely brilliant and extraordinarily well-educated men who turned out to be gay, and some of them ended up getting married, and but in retrospect, rather infamous. I'm not trying to take a anti-gay stance. I just find it interesting, and it becomes immediately quite complicated, and people, doesn't end up ultimately as a choice of behavior that leads to happiness necessarily. I mean, one of the friends of mine who was gay and had a successful family was Stephen Spender, who was later knighted Sir Stephen. He was a visiting professor at UConn when I was there. I knew him quite well, liked him very much, and terribly amusing and always great conversation with Stephen, and a good friend. And we had many friends in common. Daryl Hine, Winston Auden was one of his best friends, and also Christopher Isherwood, whom I knew in Los Angeles. At a later point, I may do some social history of comments about Los Angeles because of some of what I know is because of my cousin Virginia Robinson, who was the widow of the founder of the great Robinson stores, and she was responsible for the Beverly Hills store and ran the stores for the family. And had that's a story in itself, so that's a totally another section. So this will do for Knoxville for the moment, until I have a chance to do a little bit of boning up on the history of the Blunt family and some other families. Thank you for your patience. Nicholas! Nicholas? Pat? Where's Nick? I'm through.